With the announcement from Xiaomi finally announcing that the Xiaomi 14 is coming to a global market, we've managed to get our hands on it, and we want to give you everything that we know in our first impressions of the Xiaomi 14. We'll get right into what this Xiaomi 14 can do, and now it's available outside of China, you might be thinking about picking this up. And if you do and you have a look at the specs of this phone on paper, it's starting to look a little bit like a flagship phone, but it's not. It just gives off flagship vibes. Let's start with the display, and we get a 6.3-inch 120Hz LTPO 1.5K AMOLED display, and I actually love the display size, as this is one of those phones that's pretty easy to use with one hand. And if you have a look at how ultra thin the design of these bezels are, it doesn't feel like you're compromising on having a smaller display because it feels a lot bigger than it is. One of my main gripes with phones is that they are so big now, and I think a 6.3-inch display might just be the sweet spot. With that display, it gives you Dolby Vision and HDR10+, so when watching content, it actually looks pretty great, and now especially since it's taken a huge jump in its top screen brightness as well. The Xiaomi 14 has jumped from 1900 nits of peak brightness from last year's device over to an eye-watering 3000 nits this time round when viewing HDR content, which actually phenomenal when watching that HDR content. It's vibrant, it's bright, it's everything that you would want from a display in 2024. The trend this year seems to be that flat is back and the curves are out, and on this year's Xiaomi 14 you get a completely flat display on this device, which for me is a big plus because I just think that flat displays are where we should always be. The glass back on the Xiaomi 14 has a slightly curved feel to it as well, so actually the phone doesn't seem too boxy in your hand and it sits there really nicely. The one thing about that back glass though is that it's a bit of a fingerprint magnet with its glossy finish, so a case could be a good idea with this because if you have a look at it from whatever angle you hold it or you view it, there's just fingerprints everywhere. While we're talking about the back of that phone, I want to talk about the charging speeds here because wireless and wired charging are seriously impressive with the Xiaomi 14. Xiaomi says that this can do 50 watts wireless charging, which means that it can get from 0 to 100% in around about 46 minutes, which is pretty impressive. It has 10-watt reverse wireless charging as well, and it has a sizzling 90-watt wired charging by using the power brick that came coupled with our version that we got our hands on, which means to get from 0 to 100%, it just takes over 30 minutes, and more phones need this type of quick charging. The battery inside the Xiaomi 14 is a 4610 mAh battery, which means that it should be more than power efficient to last you all day no matter if you're on social media, gaming, using that camera. But if you actually then did need to charge it, remember 0 to 100% in just 31 minutes. Let's move on to the cameras of the Xiaomi 14, and you get a triple camera setup on the back of this phone. This is using Xiaomi's new Light Fusion 900 image sensor, and you get a 50 megapixel main, a 50 megapixel telephoto, and a 50 megapixel ultra wide, and they're all in collaboration with Leica. I've got to say, the camera housing on the back of the Xiaomi 14 is humongous, and I would usually call it a camera housing, but in this case, it's more of a camera castle. The pictures though that you get out of that camera castle, I have to say, are really quite impressive. They come across as vibrant but natural, and you get some really great lowlights and highlights no matter if you're using the 50 megapixel main, the telephoto, or that ultra wide. I know that how pictures look are usually down to personal preference, but for me, these stack up with the iPhones, the Pixels, and the Galaxies of the world. When it comes to video that the Xiaomi 14 can do, it can record up to 8K video, but I think the sweet spot here for any sort of video is always going to be that 60 frames per second at 4K. I would say it's not the best video in the world. I mean, it looks really nice and the colors are punchy and vibrant, but I feel like stabilization does let this down just ever so slightly. So any sort of movement, it does look a little bit jittery. There is something though that I think will take a little bit of getting used to if you pick up the Xiaomi 14 and you've never used a Xiaomi before, and that's going to be HyperOS. HyperOS feels really familiar and looks like it's taken a lot from other OSs, but there's definitely a little bit of learning to do to try and get the most of it. For example, it took quite a little bit of effort to get simple things like an always-on display set up, and it's missing some of those really important features like screen on time. I'm sure HyperOS will get better over time, but now it just needs a little bit of refinement because it's just missing a few things here and there. And it can be a bit of a transition period when you come over from a more established OS. I have to say the Xiaomi 14 is a seriously impressive device. There are a few things that I think it could do better. So for example, the under the screen fingerprint reader, and I think it's a little bit too low in that display, but you know, this is something you will get used to. But we don't know exactly yet how much that the Xiaomi 14 is going to cost when it comes to the global market. However, as soon as we know, we'll put a pinned comment down below so you know exactly how much it will cost. From the first impressions that I've had with this Xiaomi 14, I actually really like the phone. Of course, the OS will take a little bit of getting used to, but it has some really impressive cameras that can take some phenomenal photos, and I actually really like the size. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Could you see yourself moving over to a Xiaomi 14? Before you head off, why not subscribe to Android Authority as well? And if you do that, we will see you in the next video.